Bendy in a Dark Revival just released, despite me personally thinking it wouldn't ever come out. But while the game's reception has been incredibly positive thus far, I played the game front to back multiple times to try and see if the hype for the game is actually worth it. Anyway, Bendy in a Dark Revival is a story of a young lady named Audrey who in the prologue chapter takes a break from her personal studio work to go get some coffee, but is quickly interrupted by another worker in the studio by the name of Wilson. Wilson takes over the elevator and brings Audrey to what we now know, of course, as the ink machine. And after collecting the 6 original artifacts to power the machine like what we did in the first game, Wilson abruptly shuts the door on us before drowning ourselves inside of the inky liquid that fills up the room. After passing out, we wake up in an entirely new world that appears to be entirely made out of ink. And while searching through the world, we hear Wilson himself talking over an intercom system telling everybody in the factory he had supposedly destroyed the horrific ink demon that once lurked. And in return, he wanted the studio's inhabitants to recapture Audrey and bring her to him. While of course we spend the game trying to escape the factory before he can find us. However, what's interesting is while exploring the factory, we start to find out the dreaded ink demon may actually still be lurking around the factory after all. We even come face to face with the creature multiple times throughout the game, proving he was in fact still there. Anyway, when going through the 5 chapters in the game, we spend our time solving different puzzles to advance from point A to point B in a pretty linear system, while also being granted the ability to upgrade your health, stamina, and ability charge, while also being able to upgrade the gen pipe we receive as our main weapon in the game, giving it new charging abilities and damage increases that we'll need throughout the game's progression. Also, while we're on the topic of upgrades, we inherit multiple abilities throughout our playtime, with the Banish ability where we can sneak up on enemies and one-shot kill them, the Flow ability which allows you to teleport from one location to another in a short time, and finally the Fast Travel ability which allows the player to travel between different areas throughout the entire game. Anyway, you use these abilities and a lot of your own knowledge to make your way throughout the massive studio, while also running into tons of familiar faces like Henry, Boris/Tom, Allison and her evil counterpart Alice, and tons more, including the return of Bertram as an Easter egg. Not to mention the countless new characters from Betty to the mini Bendy himself we chase around the studio, who, might I mention, is the most adorable thing ever. Anyway, to sort of summarize, after exploring the factory through the first 3 chapters, we eventually run into the previously mentioned mini Bendy counterpart who begins to help us through the 4th chapter. That is until Joey Drew himself comes alive and teleports us to the original Chapter 1 studio, where he gives us not only insight into Henry and the real-life Joey Drew studio from the first game, but he also tells us that Audrey, who up to this point labeled herself as an orphan, was actually Joey Drew's daughter, with her apparently not even being human, but a rather creation of the ink machine itself. After hearing this news, Audrey goes into denial, and upon entering back in the studio, we lost our mini Bendy companion, just to catch him red-handed 5 minutes later, changing forms from the ink demon to his innocent mind itself, proving all along he was the true ink demon on our trails. Anyway, after infiltrating the Gent building, which contained the previously mentioned Bendy and Ink Machine characters as prisoners, we meet the original protagonist from the first game named Henry, who tells us the reason he was put away was because he tried to reset the cycle by playing some sort of film reel labeled as The End. But before we can talk too much, we are caught by a lurking keeper who attacks us when the screen goes black, just for us to randomly wake back up on a train with none other than Wilson himself. However, what's interesting is during this train ride, his demeanor entirely changed towards us, as he reveals to us that he never actually killed the ink demon, but rather encased it in a smaller, friendlier form who we had grown familiar with from the first part of the game. Anyway, to our surprise, Wilson shows a vulnerable side and actually asks for our help, saying that he actually brought us to the ink studio to save his dad's life, eventually earning over our trust as we now side ourselves with Wilson. Anyway, after a few more tasks, we are abruptly kidnapped by the demented version of Alice, where we must fight back, completing more puzzles and even having to banish her ourselves after she attacks us with a machine gun, with the end result being us almost dying until the original friendly Allison came in for the rescue, saving us with her wolf, as she calls it, who we can also pet, which is a nice touch. Anyway, after making it back to Wilson's home and getting food for his housekeeper Betty for whatever reason, we make our way to his laboratory where, to nobody's surprise, Wilson actually betrays us and says the reason he brought us here wasn't to actually save his dad, but rather to sacrifice our soul to his machine to create a being named Ship Ahoy Dudley, who was supposedly powerful enough to kill the ink demon himself. Anyway, after a cinematic fight between the two, Audrey turns the tables and instead pushes Wilson into the grinder itself, turning him into Ship Ahoy, to which we then have to go and fight Wilson in a final boss that is okay, but a little bit easy admittedly, and in the end it doesn't even really matter because Wilson got ambushed and murdered by the ink demon once more, before the ink demon proceeds to supposedly make us a part of him, which apparently was a bad thing because for the next 5 minutes we play as the ink demon, and taking control of him to search the studio and play the previously mentioned The End tape to try and restart the cycle, while all of our old pals we met along the way come to help us fight off the remaining ink monsters in our way. To make a long story short, in the end, we were successful with resetting the cycle, and Audrey has returned home where she comes to terms with herself being an ink creature of her own, while also revealing she brought another friend into the real world as well, which is where the game ends, but of course not before some cliffhangers opening up the franchise for a third title. So that's Bendy and the Dark Revival's plot and overall story, but is the game actually any good? So the first thing I loved about the game is the overall puzzles. There were so many puzzles that were super difficult, but also really fun at the same time. One of my favorites was when we were kidnapped by Alice and had to talk to prisoners to find out clues to a riddle, before eventually stepping in an electric chair that would kill us if we got it wrong. I don't know, it raised the stakes a lot in a way that I absolutely loved. I will admit, I got stuck on a lot of these puzzles for super long, but for the most part, I found myself realizing I was the one who was making the mistakes rather than feeling like it was the game's fault. Another thing I want to mention is the game design, for the most part, I think is cinematically incredible to see. And I'm most specifically pointing to areas like the Chapter 4 city area. These places are absolutely gorgeous, and I often find myself stopping in my tracks to just take a look at everything around me. I do think the game design struggles in a lot of ways, which I'll talk about here in a few, but in terms of actual visual quality, there was a major upgrade here from the last game, and I'm all here for it. I also think the storytelling and overall character quality was a major plus as well. The imp Bendy was such an adorable character that I genuinely felt bad for when he cried after we scared him, and other friendly characters like Allison were also really connectable too. Not to mention, they made it really easy to hate all the bad characters, which I hope was the goal. It felt so good throwing Wilson into the grinder to sacrifice himself, and getting to work against the ink demon was another plus. Also, I don't know if this is a good thing for you guys personally, but the horror elements of the game were also pretty good too. We have a lot of passive enemies, which for the most part are burdens to the actual gameplay itself, but they constantly keep you on your toes and scare the heck out of you. Like when the ink demon attacks and you have to frantically find a hiding spot before you lose everything. Or when this ugly thing whose name I don't even know randomly attacks us, literally scaring me to the point where I almost quit playing the game entirely.
Guys, that face is so scary. I don't want to play anymore because of that face on that fucking thing. Holy crap.
The final thing that I really enjoyed about this game was the attention to detail in a lot of minor ways as well. There were tons of little Easter eggs and callbacks to the original Bendy, and although none of these things really affect the actual game, it's just those little things that can make a title feel all the more connected. So while I enjoyed most elements of this game, there were a lot of smaller negative things that made the game experience feel a bit poor at times, starting with the game design. While like I said, the game visually is designed beautifully, very similar to the first game, even with the new art style change, getting lost is very, very common. I've played through most of the puzzles about 3 times now, and making a mental map of the game is still incredibly difficult. The combat elements also, I think, need some work. Not because they're bad per se, I actually kinda like most of the boss battles and other fights throughout the game. They just feel a little basic. Similarly to the first game, for the most part, fights consist of just hitting the bad guy and avoiding getting hit yourself. The new abilities add some extra elements, but other than that, the battle mechanics are kind of just mid. Also, I feel like they underutilized a lot of game elements, like the train station where we can travel across different locations and the ability that literally allows us to teleport. Because we only ever use the train system for one single mission, and it's to get food for Betty. And as far as I know, you never need to use the teleporter at all. I didn't anyway. Maybe it's for some sort of Easter eggs, but I'm not exactly sure. I know they wanted to avoid backtracking as much as possible, which I understand, but I really think there was a missed opportunity with the train as a whole. Also, I can't really tell if this is a glitch or not, but halfway throughout the game, it felt like they gave up on giving us a path for the game. And while in Chapter 1, we constantly have a nice list of objectives telling us what to do, by Chapter 3, for me anyway, I didn't have any objectives objectives at all. I don't know if it was a glitch or just bad design, but speaking of glitches, the biggest thing I think that holds this game back is the polishing issues. You could tell there's a lot of stuff that could have been done just a little bit better with time, especially the animations, because at times they look stunningly great, but at other times, especially later in the game, the lower quality animation really starts to show. And I'd say it's to the point where it directly takes away from the intensity of the moments. Like when we sacrifice Wilson, it's a big moment in the game, but it just comes out feeling a little bit awkward. Also, like I said, this game has a ton of glitches, and most of them are pretty bad too. From my experience in 2.5 playthroughs, and I'll explain why I said a half in a second, I had a ton of glitches. There were times where the AI would just get frozen in place, sort of defeating the sneak elements of the game entirely. And also, it was really easy to fall out of the map because sometimes parts of the game wouldn't load and you could just walk out of the game entirely. You can also tell pretty much any time that something new rendered because it absolutely tears your performance up, giving massive frame drops every time you enter a new area or something big is about to happen, which while these performance issues may vary depending on how good your computer is, it really does kill the suspense of the game. But the biggest glitch in the entire game, and the reason I said I have 2.5 playthroughs, is because it's actually possible to get entirely soft locked, and it's really easy in fact. For me, during the second chapter, I was trying to test if you could jump across the many holes throughout the game, which spoiler alert, you can, but they put up invisible walls to stop it. But anyway, after I died, I spawned inside of the locker room area of the game, which was a place I was yet to unlock, yet it put me there for whatever reason, which may not sound that bad until you consider that because I didn't break the lock to originally enter the room, I was stuck inside of that room permanently. In fact, I was only running on autosave, so that meant the only way to get out was to start the game from the very beginning, which was literally a game-ruining bug, and had I not known this glitch existed, I would have spent hours trying to solve a puzzle that never existed, which is incredibly frustrating because it makes it hard to tell if I'm missing a piece of the puzzle or if the game itself was just entirely broken. It made me second guess everything and it killed the immersion entirely. But I guess with that being said, speaking overall, I do still think Bendy and the Dark Revival is a good game. It's a great game, in fact. It entirely blew my mind, especially with the story elements and the puzzles themselves. However, for the incredible amount of thought they put into these smaller things, they sacrificed a lot of basic gameplay elements that made it sort of annoying to play through. On the bright side though, luckily most of my complaints aren't fundamental issues, and these could easily be fixed through updates. And with a couple patches being released here and there, which I imagine they're already working on, they can make the game infinitely better. Because otherwise, it's a great game that blew my expectations out of the water, since I feel like me and a lot of people deep inside were worrying that the game could have turned out more like a FNAF security breach, which I don't think it has. Did you guys enjoy the game? Let me know in the comments below, subscribe, and peace.